Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, Jumbo-Visma complete the Grand Tour hat-trick in the most dominant of fashions. A 1-2-3 for the team at the Vuelta a España, with the nicest guy in pro cycling, Sepp Kuss, taking the win. I'll be looking back at exactly how they did that and why I think Remco Evenepoel was the key to Sepp Kuss's success. I'll also wrap up a whole host of other races, including the first Cyclo-cross of this season. This week in the world of racing, we learnt that Mathieu van der Poel is the new Remco Evenepoel, as in he's unbeaten in one-day races in white shorts since winning the rainbow jersey. After 2 races in black shorts, he raced the Super 8 Classic on Saturday in white and promptly took his first win as world champion. His first of many, you would imagine. We also learnt that an unchained Remco Evenepoel is a joy to watch. Freed from the shackles of riding for GC and the conservative racing needed for that, Evenepoel animated almost every single stage of the final week of La Vuelta, including stage 21, in what was the most exciting final stage of a Grand Tour that I've seen in a very, very long time. And finally, we learnt that nice guys don't always finish last. Sepp Kuss, everybody's favourite super domestique, did what many, probably including himself, thought would be impossible and triumphed at a Grand Tour. Not many people had thought Kuss had a chance of victory ahead of the Vuelta a España, although one man did.
The point is that we shouldn't race against each other during the stages, but yes, against the others. And I mean, when we have us with worries who is first, who is second, doesn't really matter. And yeah, also Sepp maybe can win it.
But even when Kuss went up the road on stage 6, gaining 3 minutes on most of the GC favourites, even when he went into the leader's jersey 2 days later, there was still a lot of doubts as to whether he'd have the strength to retain it. And there was good reasoning behind those doubts. Number one, his time trialling ability. On the one hand, he's never shone in that discipline. On the other, he's never really needed to. Number two, his lack of experience in leading a Grand Tour or any other major stage race and the pressures and added responsibilities that go with that. Number three, the fact that this was his 3rd Grand Tour of the season. Surely he would pay for those earlier efforts. And number four, the lofty ambitions of his own teammates, Vingegaard and Roglič, who came to the race to win it themselves. As time passed, each of those questions was answered, one by one. In the time trial, Kuss finished 13th, losing just 1 minute and 13 seconds of his advantage to Evenepoel, less than a minute to Roglič, and just 11 seconds to Jonas Vingegaard. An impressive performance, to say the very least, and one that kept him in the lead of the GC by over a minute. And for me, the biggest key to Sepp Kuss's final victory was Remco Evenepoel. Hear me out on this. Up to stage 13, Jumbo-Visma's main threat was the Belgian. Rightly so. He was the defending champion, he'd looked solid as a rock throughout, and he's a super talent. Without Evenepoel in the race, Jumbo-Visma may not have played the Sepp Kuss card on stage 6. That move put pressure on Evenepoel and his Soudal Quick-Step teammates and put Jumbo-Visma firmly in the driving seat, even though Vingegaard and Roglič still had ground to make up. On to that stage 13, and Evenepoel had an unpredicted and inexplicably bad day in the high mountains. With Almeida also distanced, Jumbo-Visma took the decision to turn the screws and eliminate both of them on that day. A stage in which they finished 1-2-3 on the Col de Tourmalet, and a day in which they went from having 3 riders in the top 7 of GC to having 3 riders in the top 3. Why did this make such a big difference to Kuss? Well, if Evenepoel hadn't had that bad day, Roglič and Vingegaard would have been free to follow any moves he made. Should Kuss have had a bad day, Roglič and Vingegaard were both well placed to follow the moves that Evenepoel made and then try to take time back from him. Without that threat and without anybody else looking capable of threatening any of the Jumbo-Visma trio, there was a complete change in the dynamics of the race. Now, Vingegaard's attack on the Tourmalet made complete sense tactically. At the time he made it, he was just a handful of seconds in front of Ayuso and Mas in the GC, so it put them on the back foot and meant that Jumbo-Visma didn't have to make a decision on who would ride for who on the climb when there were just 3 of them left there. His attack on the climb to Behez a few days later also made some sense. Firstly, he wanted to win the stage and dedicate it to his best friend, Nathan van Hooijdonk, who that morning had fallen ill at the wheel of his car. And they couldn't possibly have foreseen the poo show that was the chase behind. A bunch of pro riders and teams who seemingly had no idea what to do when faced with a surprisingly early attack. Vingegaard put over a minute into all of their GC rivals in the space of under 4 kilometres, when really, if any other team had taken some responsibility, it would have been far, far less. And it left Vingegaard just 29 seconds behind Kuss going into the Angliru stage, which is where, of course, it all kicked off. Now, a lot has been said about what happened there, and at the point we're at now, it's all water under the bridge. To my mind, though, what happened would have been excusable had Kuss been dropped by anyone from another team. But the reason so many took umbrage to the way they rode that day was that Kuss wasn't dropped by anybody else. He was only dropped by the teammates he selflessly helped so often. Kuss fought valiantly, out-sprinting Landa for the bonus seconds, for which he later apologised, and retained the red jersey by just 8 seconds. With what happened after that in the race, it doesn't seem like a big deal. Roglič took a prestigious stage victory on the Angliru, and then with Vingegaard, worked to help Sepp Kuss retain the red jersey. It was an unprecedented situation in modern cycling, and one in which there were a lot of different opinions, almost all of them valid. You can completely understand why Roglič wanted to continue to race for the win. After all, he'd spent months preparing solely for that race, and he's not getting any younger. Given that we've later learned that the team management had said that they could continue to race themselves to that point, so long as one of them took the overall win, there was no reason for Roglič to wait. He wasn't a threat really to Kuss, unless the American completely cracked in the last kilometre of that climb. And for Jonas, well, he wasn't to know whether Kuss would completely crack, and probably didn't want to gift the overall win to Roglič if he did. Maybe we made too much of it. Maybe we were creating drama that just wasn't there. We don't know, but I dare say that we'll learn more about what happened behind the scenes in the weeks, months and years to come. One day later, the orders from team management changed, and we had a very visible "we're working for Sepp Kuss" display from his teammates, which they backed up again on stage 20, crossing the finish line arm in arm with Roglič and Vingegaard pointing to the race winner. It was a beautiful moment for the team, for cycling, and most of all, for Sepp Kuss. To me, he's really earned it, not just for what he'd done for the team before the Vuelta, but for the way he raced over those last 3 weeks. He didn't crack, he didn't have a bad time trial, and he didn't succumb to the pressures of leading a Grand Tour. It means that Jumbo-Visma become the first team to win all 3 of the men's Grand Tours in a single season, with 3 different riders to boot. The icing on the cake was that the team filled all 3 of the podium spots in Madrid, with 5 stage wins along the way. Which means that for the other squads, it's back to the drawing board. Whilst fans, pundits, commentators and probably the team itself pondered over what plan of action Jumbo-Visma should be taking with their 3-star riders, the rest of the peloton was fighting for the minor places, never looking like they might be able to prevent a clean sweep of that podium. 4 of the 6 stages that made up the final week were not won by Jumbo-Visma. Evenepoel was back to doing Evenepoel things to La Cruz de Linares on Thursday, riding breakaway companions off his wheel one by one and mathematically putting the KOM jersey out of reach for anybody else. Alberto Dainese was back to doing Alberto Dainese things one day later, i.e. going from being completely anonymous in the bunch sprints to winning one. Wout Poels gave everyone a masterclass in tactics by outwitting Evenepoel on stage 20, whilst Caden Groves took his 3rd stage win of the race in unforeseen circumstances in Madrid yesterday evening. How good was that stage? To a point, it followed the script, ambling along at the start whilst the press got their photos, Jumbo-Visma then picking up the pace and leading the peloton into Madrid, Alpes and de Koning taking over to the intermediate sprint won by Groves, and then a trio of riders forming the day's breakaway. But then just in the distance, there was a flash of white and blue around one of the 180-degree turns, and it was Evenepoel attacking one last time at the race. Groves had no choice but to follow Evenepoel. Even with the points that he'd got at the intermediate sprint, Evenepoel could still have taken green away from him if he'd won the stage and Groves had finished 10th or worst. And so we had a super group out front. Evenepoel, Ganna, Groves, Kemna and Costa, 5 stage winners from the race, plus Nico Dents along for the ride. Despite pretty much every team behind contributing to the chase, they struggled to catch the front group. One of the best will they won't they's that I can remember in cycling. And I would say that Groves in the end had a lot to thank Evenepoel for. He started his sprint from a long way before the line, and that gave Groves the perfect lead out, whilst also ensuring they stayed clear of the fast approaching bunch. And Groves was incredibly clear of mind in that sprint, wasn't he? He deliberately left a gap to Evenepoel so that he could rush at him before the line and use that slipstream, whilst also taking a glance over his shoulder to see what space he had to play with. He might not have envisaged winning that stage in that way, but my word, did it make it more spectacular than winning in a sprint. So, Kuss ends up with the GC, Groves the points jersey, Evenepoel the polka dots, Ayuso the best young rider, and Jumbo-Visma the team's classification. The Vuelta a España, as it so often does, really delivered from an entertainment point of view this year, so chapeau to all the riders who were a part of that. Just before I move on, I wanted to thank you all for the kind comments that we received from you on our coverage of the Grand Tours and Classics this year. From my side, it's just an immense pleasure and privilege to be a part of, so it's especially nice to hear that so many of you have enjoyed it with us. Right, with the Vuelta a España completed, what have we still got to look forward to this year? Well, do not despair. We're now building up to the fifth and final men's monument of the season, Il Lombardia. Next week sees a whole host of Italian one-day races on GCN+, but this week we've got the European Championships. They take place a little later this year due to the World Championship date change, but will run from Wednesday through to Sunday in Drenthe in the Netherlands. On Wednesday, we'll have the men's and women's individual time trials. Thursday, it's the mixed relay team time trial. Saturday, the women's road race, and Sunday, the men's. Van Aert, Kooi, De Maar, Pedersen, De Lee and Laporte are amongst those competing in the latter, whilst the Dutch will be the hot favourites, as ever, in the women's. Vollering, Wiebes and Van Anrooy all on the provisional start list for them. Coverage of those races are available to watch in all GCN Plus territories. Beyond that, we've also got the Skoda Tour of Luxembourg running from Wednesday through to Sunday. That will be the race that Thibaut Pinot uses to build up to his final outing as a pro rider at the Tour of Lombardy. Hirschi, Schelmoser, McNulty, Ciccone and Woods are some of the other big names on the start list there, so well worth tuning in for. And finally, on the road side of things at least, the Tour of Langkawi commences this coming Saturday, and the good news is that none of the races that we're showing live this week have any territory restrictions, so you'll all be able to watch them. And it's not just about road racing this week either. The USCX continues this weekend with rounds 3 and 4, which take place in Rochester, New York. I'll be going through what happened in the first 2 rounds a little later on in this show. Our documentary this week is all about the Monte Zoncolan. So I went to ride the climb with Dan Martin, who battled to a top 10 finish there at the Giro d'Italia in 2010. They weren't interested in asking me because I only battled for a top 100 finish. Just. Anyway, as many of you will know, it's one of the toughest mountains in Italy and the world over. In fact, the Zoncolan was once considered too difficult for the Giro d'Italia, an average gradient of 11.9% for over 10 kilometres. It's featured 8 times since its first appearance at the 97 Giro Donne, but its hellish gradients immediately earned it a reputation as a bucket list climb to be feared by both amateurs and professionals alike. World Tour rider Alessandro De Marchi and journalist Antonio Simioli, who both grew up at the foot of the Monte Zoncolan, reveal why a climb so punishing is still so loved by the locals. Here's a sneak peek.
350 watts, 7k an hour. You don't go looking for the effort here, the effort comes to you. You're basically defying gravity.
That documentary is available for all GCN Plus subscribers to watch from tomorrow. I'll move on now to the Tour de Romandie Femmes, where you've guessed it, SD Worx took the overall win. Demi Vollering followed a move by Kasia Niewiadoma on the summit finish of stage 2, attacking the Polish rider as they approached the finish line in Tourgon. The Canyon SRAM rider had done almost all of the work on that final climb, with Vollering playing the teammates card behind. Now, it's quite hard to argue against the SD Worx tactics this season. To be honest, as long as other riders and teams are prepared to work with them, or even for them, they'll continue to take advantage of that. Reusser finished 3rd, Fischer Black 5th, with Juliette Labousse in between. There were celebrations for other teams on the other 2 stages though. Karina Schrempf, who turned her attention to cycling after a career focusing on middle distance running, took a flyer in the last 3 kilometres of stage 1, and she was oh so close to victory. She took her arms off the bars just a couple of metres from the finish line, only for Bertit Zola of UAE Team ADQ to come past her and take her first World Tour level win. Schrempf claimed afterwards that she'd taken her arms off the bars to express her disappointment because she knew she was about to be overtaken. But I'm not sure I buy that. If she'd just pedalled to the line and done a bike throw, I think she'd have probably taken the victory there. Either way, a very promising ride from the Austrian champion. I have no doubt that some big wins are just around the corner for her. The third and final day ended up in a reduced group sprint and marked the third win of the season for Liana Lippert. The Movistar rider got the better of Cyclo-cross's Femmes van Empel and Silvia Persico at the finish. No problems for Vollering when it came to the GC though, which she won by 6 seconds from Nuvia Doma, 12 from her teammate Reuser. It was the 17th win of the season for Vollering, and when you consider she'd only had 12 pro wins before this year, you realise just how much of a leap she's made in 2023. On to the one-day races that took place last week. Now, I've already mentioned that Van der Poel won at the Super 8 Classic, despite his assertion that he's not on his best form. He attacked the main bunch on the Mosca Strat and bridged solo to the front group before out-sprinting them with what seemed like relative ease. Turgis and Vermeersch would have to settle for second and third. Van der Poel didn't have it all his own way at the Grand Prix Wallonie earlier in the week though, probably because he was wearing black shorts. Former winner Dylan Teuns pulled clear of the rest on the climb to the finish with Gonzalo Serrano, but it was the Spaniard who took the win at the line. On Friday, we had one of the sprints of the season at the Championship of Flanders. 3 of the biggest names in the sport going head to head in the final 200 metres. And from the head-on shot, it was hard to see who'd won it between Jasper Philipsen, Fabio Jakobsen and Dylan Groenewegen. It was clear from the photo finish though. Philipsen continuing to stake his claim as the fastest sprinter in the world right now. And he was back at it again yesterday, winning the Xana Goikse Pijl ahead of Olaf Kooi and Groenewegen. That was the Belgians' 13th win of this season so far. Only Roglič, Vingegaard and Pogačar have taken more. Down in Italy, Pavel Sivakov continued his run of form from the Canadian one-day races. He got away with Richard Carapaz at the Giro della Toscana, attacking him in the last kilometre and riding away to his first ever win in a one-day race. One day later, he was up the road with Hirschi at the Coppa Sabatini, finishing second to the Swiss champion. And 2 days after that, he was again away with Hirschi, but they were both beaten to the line by Alexei Luksenko. Great to see Sivakov making the most of his form though. He was expecting, of course, to be at the Vuelta a España, but in the end was not selected by his team Ineos Grenadiers. For Astana, that was their 10th win of the season, 6 of which have come from the Kazakh champion. On to Cyclo-cross now, and yes, Cyclo-cross is already here. The USCX series kicked off at the weekend with the first 2 rounds taking place in Roanoke, Virginia. The big news in the men's races was that Vincent Bastains turned up and didn't win. He's the man who's dominated for the past couple of years, but he certainly isn't having it his own way this year, so far at least. 34-year-old was in the front group for much of the first race, along with US champion Curtis White, but both were outshone by 3 young guns who fought it out between them at the front over the last lap. 23-year-old Loris Rier of Switzerland won the 3-up sprint to the line ahead of Belgian Anton Ferdinand and 21-year-old Andrew Strohmeyer of the USA. I think it's safe to say they'd put a fair bit of effort into that one. Ferdinand was back for revenge in round 2, going clear with Rier and looking good until this.
Which looked like it's going to come down to a battle between these two the whole race, and I think that's the way it's going to be. Ruya is so strong. Ferdinand! Oh my gosh, how did he hold that? How on earth did he hold that?
That slip, combined with a dropped chain just moments later, put an end to his hopes, and it also cost Ferdinand second place, with Bastains cruising past him for second. Ahead of them both though, Ruyer. 2 from 2 for him so far. No such surprises in the women's races. Magali Rochette turned up and Julie won both rounds by a convincing margin. On Saturday, she was already leading solo after 15 minutes of racing and would go on to win by 51 seconds, despite taking things fairly easy for much of the last lap. Then the following day, she was even more dominant. Already with a sizable gap over everybody else after just 3 minutes of racing, she would go on to take the win by 1 minute and 53 seconds. Caroline Mani was runner-up in both rounds, with Raylin Nuss in third. On to some transfer news now, and I'll start with Team DSM Firmenich, as they've signed 3 Dutch riders, or at least announced them in the last week. Bram Velten comes over from Groupama FDJ, whilst Timo Roosum and Gees Leemreiser both come over from Team Jumbo-Visma. A couple of riders have confirmed that they're moving away from Soudal Quickstep. Janneke Steimler is off to Q36.5, whilst Davide Ballerini heads back to Astana, for whom he last rode in 2019. Paulina Royackers will be moving on from Canyon SRAM and over to Alpecin Fenix next year, while Stefano Oldani is also on the move, going to Team Cofidis from Alpecin de Koning. Jake Stewart is the latest rider to be announced at Israel Premier Tech, along with George Bennett. The New Zealander had been rumoured to be going to Soudal Quick-Step as extra support in the mountains from Evenepoel, but that doesn't seem to be the case. EF Education Easy Post have extended the contract of the Italian Alberto Becciol, and they've also signed 20-year-old Jack Rootkin-Gray. The young Brit has been riding for St Piran's team this year, but will turn professional with the American squad in 2024. Right, that is all for this week's Racing News Show. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again this time next week.